Hey there, welcome to What the Flip is Economics. Today we will be diving into the impacts of global trade on young people. If you like this channel's content, be one of the rare people that actually subscribe and like the video. It really helps out and I appreciate it. Throughout this video we will look at the economic concepts of the economy, global trade, gross domestic product, interdependence, and the factors of production. This video will be split into 5 sections, some basic info to start, and then some more in-depth explanations to explain certain concepts. Then, the video will finish on a conclusion, which should be a good way to wrap up all this new information. Let's dive in. You may have heard the word economy thrown around and not really understood what it means or how it works. Economy is a sort of system for choosing how scarce resources should best be utilized so that goods and services can be used and produced. Scarcity is an important topic in the study of economics. Things that are scarce are limited and therefore more sought after and desirable. The idea of economics is centered around the idea that people have unlimited wants and desires, but scarcity of resources makes sure it isn't possible to fulfill all these wants. We can define resources as different things like land, people, and raw materials. The availability of these different things might make a country more or less suited to production of different goods or services, and we call this the factors of production. For example, due to Australia's plentiful mineral deposits, Australia can sell and supply minerals to the global market in a way that is hard for any other country to do. We can use economic indicators to track how the economy is performing and make useful observations on things like the quality of life in a country. The most prevalent economic indicators would be gross domestic capita, or GDP, inflation, and the rate of unemployment. We can use these different indicators to track how an economy is doing and analyze the global effects of events like COVID on the economy. Let's start by looking at gross domestic capita. We will start by looking at what gross domestic product, or GDP, actually is. GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced inside a country, adding the value of exports and subtracting the value of imports from the final number. When we divide the final GDP for a country by the total population of the country, we get gross domestic product per capita, or GDP per capita. GDP per capita is a very important indicator because it can be used as a rough average of wealth per person in a country. This can give us a good idea of the quality of life in a country, because countries with lower GDP per capita would have a lower standard of living when compared to a country with higher GDP per capita. That leads us to the growth rate of GDP. Positive GDP growth is good, and it signals the fact that the economy of that country is growing. But if the growth rate is too high, it signals the fact that inflation might be out of control in that country. If the growth rate of GDP is negative, shrinking, it means the economy is shrinking in that country. If the GDP of a country shrinks for 2 quarters in a row, a recession is called, which is a type of financial crisis. Recession brings a decline in consumer spending, employment rates, and often leads to job cuts and layoffs due to slow business investment and growth. Young people can be indirectly affected by recession because of the additional hardship that recession brings. Emotional well-being of children is negatively affected, along with their grades and test results. Luckily, the last time we saw a recession was back in 2020 with the global health crisis of COVID-19, and since then, when looking at the growth rate of GDP in Australia, we have only had positive growth since 2020. Currently in Australia, we are in a cost of living crisis. This cost of living crisis is mainly caused by a rise in Australian inflation, a concept that we will learn about in this section of the video. This rise in inflation is particularly seen on essentials like bread and eggs and food and fuel. At its core, inflation is a rise in the prices of the normal goods and services that households typically buy and consume. Inflation increases the price of goods and services all the time, but if inflation can be made to increase at a certain target percentage, then the wages that people are paid should be able to catch up with the increase in prices, and the cost of living should stay the same. For February of 2025, the inflation percentage is well within the Reserve Bank of Australia's target of 2 to 3% increase in prices annually. But previously, due to economic ramifications that COVID-19 caused, the inflation rate creeped up to a peak of 7.8% in September 2022. That inflation rate was too high, and wages were not able to keep up with that kind of increase, causing goods and services to increase in price, while everyone has no more money to actually account for this rise. But on the flip side, if inflation falls, called deflation, consumers might delay purchases because they know the prices are falling, which causes reduced spending and demand. This could lead to a deflating spiral with loss of jobs and lower wages, which is bad for everyone. This uncertain economic situation is causing Generation Z in Australia to be stressed about finances. 7 out of 10 Gen Zers see finance as a major concern, which is surprisingly higher than other generations. But Gen Z Australians are the most likely generation to actually want to improve their standard of money skills, with 9 out of 10 Gen Zs having the desire to improve their financial skills. The unemployment rate is an important economic indicator that could be used with other indicators to make an objective observation of an economy. Employment is affected by other things like inflation, GDP, and the factors of production. Looking at the Australian Government's Institute of Health and Welfare report on employment and unemployment, we can see a sharp drop in the employment rate of Australia, which bottoms out in May 2020 at 69.5% of Australians employed. This drop, starting in March 2020, coincides with the beginning of the world's response to COVID. However, Australia is resilient, with employment rates rising to levels higher than before the drop by May 2021. Inside this drop, however, Gen Z was affected the worst. This is because most employed Gen Zs were working in service and hospitality areas, like restaurants and travel services. These areas were obviously hit very hard during the pandemic, as they were forced to shut down, prompting layoffs and even bankrupting some companies. If the employment rate is too low, businesses will not have enough human capital to produce goods and services effectively. But if the employment rate is too high, businesses may find it hard to get workers because everyone is already working, which may increase the rate of inflation as the businesses hand the higher costs to the consumers. Thanks for hanging through this video, and I hope you're able to take something away from it. If you like the video and want to see more, subscribe and like the video. Bye!